Vietnam is a country in Southeast Asia and is the easternmost country on the Indochinese peninsula. It is characterized by its dense jungles, farmland, and rivers. During the 1880s, the region was heavily impacted by French colonialism. Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia were all controlled by France and collectively referred to as Indochine François, or French Indochina. And during that time, it became one of France's most important colonial possessions. French colonialism was focused largely on production, profit, and labor. It had a profound impact on the lives of the people in Vietnam and forever changed the face of Southeast Asia. Vietnam before French colonization was an Asian kingdom with a feudal social structure, heavily influenced by both Confucianism and Buddhism. For centuries, China held the region within its sphere of influence. Most of the people were peasants and were put to work through heavy labor and harsh treatment by their Chinese lords, which fueled multiple rebellions and uprisings. After centuries of trying, the Vietnamese finally secured their independence in the year 938, and the Vietnamese, after that, were mostly fishermen, cattle herders, and rice farmers. Vietnam's long coast and access to the sea allowed for frequent visits and settlement from many seafaring peoples, including Cambodians, Indians, and many others. Vietnam had many different ethnicities and languages, and a great diversity in social, religious, and cultural values. French colonialism of Indochina began in 1857 with the decision to invade Vietnam made by Napoleon III. It was a result of French capitalism and the need for resources and overseas markets. The invasion started with an attack on the port of Da Nang in 1858, and it would take over 50 years to stake claim to the entire Indochinese region. The French justified their colonial expeditions through their own principle called Mission Civilisation, or civilizing mission. This was their responsibility to colonize underdeveloped regions in Africa and Asia and revolutionize them, introduce them to modern political ideas, social reforms, industrial methods, and new technology. In the minds of the French, without European intervention, these places would remain impoverished. The Mission Civilisation was a facade, with the real motive for French colonialism being profit and economic exploitation. It was driven by the demand for resources, raw materials, and cheap labor. Over time, colonial officials and French companies transformed Vietnam's thriving subsistence economy into a proto-capitalist system based on land ownership, increased production, exports, and low wages. Millions of Vietnamese no longer worked to provide for themselves, rather for the benefit of their French rulers. The French seized vast swaths of land and reorganized them into large plantations. Rice and rubber were the main crops of these plantations, and the amount of land used for growing rice almost quadrupled in 20 years after 1880. Southern Vietnam also had 25 gigantic rubber plantations built. By the 1930s, Indochina was supplying 60,000 tons of rubber each year, 5% of all global production. The French also tapped into Vietnam's deposits of coal, tin, and zinc, as well as coffee, paper, and tea. Most of the resources were sold as exports, and almost all of the profits went to the French capitalists, investors, and officials. Very little, if any, made it to the Vietnamese. French working conditions on rubber plantations were especially brutal and inhumane. Long hours, no breaks, or adequate food and water, and beatings for slow or reluctant workers. There was malnutrition and malaria, and it was common to have several workers die in a single day. The French also went about their colonialism through extensive taxation on the Vietnamese. An example would be income taxes on wages. The state also took control of commodities used extensively by the locals like rice and wine. Most Vietnamese had previously made their own rice and wine and gathered their own salt. However, by the start of the 1900s, both could only be purchased through French outlets at heavily inflated prices. All of Indochina was ruled by the French Governor-General and his palace in Hanoi. The French largely lived on plantation estates or in cities. Places like Saigon, the capital of South Vietnam, were made to look indistinguishable from French cities through the use of French architecture. Most of the French officials did not even learn the language of their subjects, and instead installed a series of puppet emperors, and employed a network of French-speaking Vietnamese officials who were willing to carry out their wishes. This led to those Vietnamese taking advantage of their position, and greed and corruption was prevalent. The French also introduced ideas that improved the lives of the Vietnamese, one of which being education. French teachers educated the people in French history, law, and literature. They were also taught science, engineering, and mathematics in specialized private schools attended by roughly 20% of Vietnamese boys. This prepared the smartest of those to attend French universities in Indochina or France. The French also installed their own legal system, which replaced the one the Vietnamese had used for centuries. Before French intervention, punishments for crimes were often cruel and harsh. For example, people who stole were beheaded. The French reduced penalties in those cases and believed their system was much more humane. In all, French colonial rule only benefited the lives of certain Vietnamese living in urban areas. The lives of the general population were undoubtedly worse off due to the French. Anyone who resisted colonial rule faced punishments like exile or execution. This unrest prompted a rise in nationalism in the early 20th century. This rise would eventually lead to Vietnam's independence. French colonialism forever impacted the country. It was only during the Second World War that the Vietnamese were able to liberate themselves from the colonial oppressors. With the French preoccupied in Europe, the Japanese took over the region. Near the end of the war in 1945, Japan was weak and retreating. With resistance groups like the Viet Minh established by Communist and Vietnamese nationalist Ho Chi Minh, Japan was finally removed from Vietnam and the country declared its independence. Ho Chi Minh established a communist dictatorship in the north and eventually invaded the democratic regime that had been established in the south. This prompted the long and costly war known as the Vietnam War that pitted the communist government of North Vietnam against the South with its principal ally, the United States. The conflict itself was the byproduct of the larger Cold War between the Soviet Union and the United States. In the end, the Americans pulled out of Vietnam and gained nothing after 30 years of involvement. The byproduct of the war was 2 million dead civilians in the North and South. The South fell to the Communist North in 1975. The country remained a single united communist state until the 1980s, in which the government made a series of changes to improve issues like education and quality of life among its people. The government started to realize that communism was not a solution for rapidly modernizing or growing its economy. It was the mass hunger and suffering that allowed the communists to come to power, but they were never able to solve the issue itself. The government introduced a series of market reforms called Dai Moi, which changed the economy into more of a supply and demand system. In rural areas, the government allowed farmers to keep what they grew and sell it at markets. Rice production rebounded dramatically, making Vietnam one of the world's largest rice exporters. Exports of tea and coffee also grew significantly. In the cities, new factories began producing items like shoes, clothes, and computers that could be sold in other countries. By 2001, Vietnam's economy was growing rapidly. To this day, Vietnam is still a major exporter of agricultural goods such as pepper, rice, nuts, and coffee, and is still a major exporter of rubber. Much of Vietnam's modern transportation network can trace its roots back to the French colonial era, when it was used to facilitate the transportation of raw materials to its main ports. With the rapid growth of the economy, the nation has transformed itself through urbanization. Due to its rapid economic growth, the country itself has made tremendous progress in terms of education and life expectancy. Colonialism's long-lasting impact on Vietnam is that it industrialized and modernized the nation. It turned the country into the modern-day exporter of agricultural goods that it is today. It was their rule and the repercussions of that rule that led to the Vietnamese people gaining their independence.